Okay, all right, we are going to kick off, everybody. My name is Nathan Jager. I'm a marketing manager here at EchoStor Technologies. I'm going to just start, kick things off and then hand it to our ServiceNow pros. As far as the agenda for today, we're going to talk, this quick welcome. I'm going to talk about, we are going to be giving out some gift card vouchers for people for lunch. To have lunch another time. Quick EchoStor intro. We're going to get into the heart of what we're doing around rapid solutioning on the ServiceNow platform, how to approach solutioning and what to consider, and then a quick demo on part of our return to work application, and then Q&A. So pretty simple stuff there. As we go on for lunch, everybody that attends this, we're going to shoot you out a $25 Grubhub gift card to the email that you registered with. If there's any issue with the email you registered with, or if you're somehow on this without registering, you can just put something in the Q&A, or you can email me, Nathan, Nathan .Jager. You can see my name as the host, just nathan.jager at echostor.com. So that's that. And this will probably take a couple hours after the webinar, so just be patient. We appreciate you guys joining us. We want you guys to have a lunch on us at another time. The other thing is Kahoot. We're going to be using this website called Kahoot at the beginning and end, just to kind of keep things interactive. It's just a mobile website, so if you have your phone available, you can also do it on the computer, easier on the phone, but it's just kahoot.it. So just keep this up. It's just, again, we're trying to keep things interactive. We know that everybody's doing webinars here during COVID, and so we're trying to keep this a little more interactive. So I think that is pretty much it. I'm going to pass it along to our EchoStor presenters on the ServiceNow team and pass it over to Dave Hansen.
Yeah, thanks, Nate. So my name is Dave Hansen. Some of you might know me already. I represent the ServiceNow team here at EchoStor. If you're not familiar with who EchoStor is, and specifically our ServiceNow practice, EchoStor itself has been around for 15 years, and the ServiceNow practice has been around for about 5. We went on to win the Specialist Partners of Americas in 2020. A lot of it has to do with really our experience and the industry veterans that have really been a part of this team, including Paul Wydra. So I'll let him do an intro in just a second. But Paul, if you don't mind kicking over one more slide. There's a picture of me. Fun fact, that was supposed to be updated, but then COVID hit. So that is a very outdated picture of me. But yeah, I've been in the industry for about 8 years, specifically around ServiceNow and enterprise service management, and very excited to represent the team here at EchoStor. So I'll pass it off to Paul and the main star of the show here.
Thanks, Dave. Afternoon, everyone. Good morning. So similar to Dave, I myself have been in the ServiceNow ecosystem for the last 8 years or so, working probably about 2 desks over from Dave when we both worked at ServiceNow. As far as a lot of my history with the product and with the company, I have been on really both sides of the fence in terms of from a solutioning perspective, more of a pre-sales capacity. How can we best set up engagements for implementing different aspects of the platform? I've also been on the delivery side in terms of implementations and actually doing the setup. And my experience ranges from the technical aspects as well as the more the business process side of the house. And related to that, I'm actually a participant right now in ServiceNow's Certified Master Architect program. And I did want to call this out because there's currently less than 50 in the world right now. But ServiceNow, it's always been a great platform for rapid developing. And the gift and the curse is we can do anything on the platform. And there's really best practice considerations to go into how should we position a solution and what goes into the initial process and the thinking. A lot of what we're going to talk to today, but it's great to see that ServiceNow is seeing the need for Let's make sure we're always thinking about best practices. We're considering the business process as well as the technical aspects and the wrenches that need to be turned. And that's a lot of what we're going to be talking about today. And as a fun fact, Dave is an above average start league player. I am a below average golfer. So the focus of today and what we're hoping you'll learn is really where do you begin with solutioning when you get an initial ask. I know most on the webinar today, you may be an administrator of ServiceNow, you may be more of a business leader in your organization, working on transformational projects or leveraging ServiceNow. So this will help understand how we approached the need for how do we get back into the office, not only at EchoStor, but also with a lot of our clients who have been asking about the return to work. So, where do we begin with that solutioning process? What do we consider when approaching the requirements that are involved here? And then how do we solution with future growth and changes in mind? A lot of what we're seeing is the need to get back to the office is critical for some customers. Other customers, it might be more of a later conversation. But if we're starting out with something that's more of a minimum viable product, we need to get some of these key requirements completed, but we need to be sure we're not essentially hindering ourselves from growing in the future. That's really a big piece to your solutioning process, is to always consider that. So before we jump into specifics in the presentation and walking through solutioning, I did want to jump over to Kahoot and ask a couple of questions before we begin. So as Nate mentioned, if you have your mobile device handy, that's typically the easiest way to join Kahoot. All you have to do is, whether it be from your mobile device or from desktop computer, just go to kahoot.it, enter in this PIN. You don't need an account, and actually it'll ask you for a nickname. Feel free to make up any nickname you want. This isn't going to be logged or tracked. We really just want to use it as part of today. So feel free to enter in a nickname and we'll give you a few seconds here. We're really just looking to ask some initial questions where you are today, and also we'll use this as getting for some feedback towards the end of the webinar, as we're looking to run more of these, and we want to see how it's received. Excellent. Looks like we've got a few people jumping in now. If you've never used Kahoot before, it's very interesting. It plays music in the background. It could be quite intense, but I always like the music. I'm going to let you hear some of it. All right, we'll give it about 10, 15 more seconds, let a few more people jump in, and then we'll get started. And 5 more seconds. Perfect. So just to begin, one of the first questions we have, so you'll see the questions on the screen, and then on your mobile device or your other device, you'll just want to answer the question. So where is your organization today in regards to reopening? Have you started reopening? Are you in planning? Is planning beginning soon? Or is it just crazy to be talking at this point going into the office? Okay, great. So it looks like most of you have already started the reopening process. Got a handful in planning, or planning is coming into play. But I think what's key here is we all have to get back to the office at some point. I think everyone agrees to that. It's really a matter of when. So it's good to see a lot of you have already started the reopening process, and some of you are in the planning or starting to planning. So one last question before we get started. In terms of app development today, what platform do you mainly use for app development? Are you using ServiceNow, SharePoint, another SaaS or PaaS tool, custom development? Three more seconds, let a few more answers come in. All right, so it looks like a lot of you are leveraging ServiceNow today for your application, which is good. Some using SharePoint, custom apps might come into play. So hopefully from today, if you're not leveraging ServiceNow, this could be a good discussion point for how do we approach solutioning with the platform? Why does ServiceNow stand out and is a good use case as opposed to building custom apps or using other tools that you might have? So thank you for doing that. I'll have a few more questions at the end to collect some feedback. So if you want to leave that screen up on your mobile device or wherever, just throw it to the side, and we'll get back to that towards the end. So to begin, really looking for how did this start? So similar to a lot of you, I'm sure, this really started back in March when a lot of this started unfolding. As most of you know, or if you didn't know, ServiceNow responded with how do we help with that emergency response of helping organizations deal with the COVID outbreak. So a few applications that came out were how could you report your health to your manager? How can we send out questions to our users to get answers? And then more specific apps for state and local government agencies to actually help with handling the exposure and response. So in terms of a lot of our customers, though, these apps didn't quite address the need for coming back to work yet. This was still very much in the trenches. How do we handle we're all closed right now. How's everybody doing? Keeping track of our employees and our friends, really. So around this time, we started having these conversations for, okay, when we get back to work in April, really this conversation started. It also started with thinking about EchoStor in terms of when we reopen our office, what should the process look like? But again, with a lot of our customers who use ServiceNow, we're also having this conversation. What this led to was it was originally a proof of concept that was built out in a couple of hours that we then turned into a full application on the ServiceNow platform. We made it available on ServiceNow's Share website for other users to be able to leverage this. But what we wanted to do is it was really a way to start seeing, here's how this can be addressed. Here's one use case for this. There's a lot of other applications out there. And then as you know, after this, ServiceNow did build very specific applications for the safe workplace return. But it's important to make sure we have, okay, where do we start? What's essentially a good place to understand from the requirements perspective? How do we get going on this? What's important? And it seemed the common need was, I just want to know who's coming into the office, and then essentially, are they healthy enough to come in and be able to track that at the simplest level? So we wanted to build that and also build it in a way where you can take the application and don't need to necessarily have a full implementation engagement for a simple application like just a building access request. Now, of course, there's other apps involved, other use cases where that is definitely needed, but want to make it as configurable as possible, and you'll see some of that and what we mean part of the solutioning process. So at the beginning, where this starts is what are the goals? It's really important to understand what do we want to get out of this solution? And the initial ask was usually, we need ServiceNow to help us with reopening. Okay, what does that mean? So unpacking that a little bit more for us internally, and as well as some of those initial customers we were speaking to, some of the initial goals were, we want to track users who are intending to visit the office locations on specific dates. We want to allow for understanding of building occupancy for who's planning on arriving. So not only, yes, I'm coming into the office, I'm going to schedule and make myself a reservation on Thursday, there's also the need for, in certain states, based on the reopening phase that you're currently in, there's a requirement or a mandatory, you can only have maybe 25% of your building's normal occupancy in there at one time during Massachusetts phase 2, as an example. Then in phase 3, and maybe it'll be 50%. So we needed to make sure we were understanding we weren't over capacity for what was allowed at that time. We want to ensure that users visiting the office are healthy, and really want to leverage ServiceNow's pre-built functionality for communication for health check. What's interesting in having these conversations with our clients who have ServiceNow, it seemed like a natural fit for how do we use this for the request tracking process, because you have a lot of that, what I'll call the foundation of the house, where you already have the communication. Maybe you have the portal you're using. It can send out emails to your users. You already have your users defined in there. So when we're talking about how do we leverage the platform for return to work activities, it's much more straightforward than having to build out a custom app from PHP or ASP, where you got to build a lot of that foundation. So in terms of the actual requirements process, so we have the initial understanding, we have some of the goals, and this is where we really get into the specific use case for return to work, but also a good best practice for how you should consider requirements in general. So we'll talk through this. First and foremost, you want that initial understanding of the ask. Then you want to get that into a little more detail. How we do this at EchoStor, and we know how other clients also do this, is with agile stories. So taking the requirement and turning it into, as a certain user, I want to be able to do this so that I can get some output or a reason for doing that. So gather those initial requirements, groom them, and then have an initial recommendation or proposal for what to do. So the initial understanding, it's really simple to think about, but you really want to consider, before I even start talking about specific requirements, I want to know the who, the what, the why, the where, and the when. So thinking about returning to work, who is involved? So you have we're using the general term fulfiller here, but you have somebody who's actually maybe handling the requests in the system, tackling any updates that need to happen, but you also have the security guard. This can be your security guard, facilities team, but really that person at the front door who's either handling a check-in process or doing some aspect of funneling in the users who are coming in. You have somebody who needs to approve. We'll talk about where that fits into play. And then you also have your user community. So are we talking employees? Are we talking contractors? Are we talking visitors? And something that immediately came out when we were mapping out the who for, at least internally at EchoStor, initially, we're not having any visitors in the office, or at least if we do, they're not going to be part of this process. You want to make sure you have a true focus on the scope of what this app should do. And for us, it was initially, we're going to have internal employees come in, maybe contractors, people who are in our system. Visitors, yes, we want to do it. The platform can support it, but that's something more from a day 2 perspective, phase 2, whatever that may be, something a little further down the line. Speaking with some of our customers, that was also their initial idea. When building out a process, we got to focus on our employees right now. We'll handle visitors in the next stage. The what really began with the building access request process. So very simply, we need to know who wants to come in, what location are they visiting, when are they visiting, and why. So that one was pretty straightforward. As far as the why, we already looked to our goals, so we had those defined. We really know why we're looking to do this. Where, we view it as, from a request process, where are users coming from? Where will this be used from? So internally at EchoStor, and again at some of the customers we were talking to, not everyone's using the Now mobile applications today. A lot of users, end users, might not even log into ServiceNow that often. So the initial need was, it needs to be mobile. We'll flesh out the details of what that means, but our users are on our cell phones all the time, and they may or may not be actually logged into ServiceNow in some capacity. So that'll come up as well. And the when. The when really being, are we talking about something that we have the time to do a more rigid requirements gathering process, figure out everything up front and sort of work through it? Is this more of an agile process? Are we talking minimum viable product? Us internally, we were having this conversation in April, and we were looking to open the office in May. So this was very quick. Okay, what do we need for day 1 in order to reopen? So then started the gathering of the requirements. So there were a good amount. This is a sample of some of the ones that come to mind, top of mind. But these are all in a scenario of, what am I looking for the system to do? So we need to track the visits. We don't want to exceed the daily allowed building capacity, ensure people visiting the office are healthy. If the building's full, allow the user to request. So the concept being, if there are 25 spaces in the building, all 25 are used up, and on the 26th going to make a reservation, we still want to let the user submit that, but there needs to be an approval process to determine what does that actually mean. And one of the original requirements was, if that happens, if the building is full, the approval process should be automated. Again, the request from mobile, answering the health check from email. So again, our users very mobile focused, may not be logged into ServiceNow. If they get the health check, they should be able to do it in their email, not have to log in to ServiceNow. Allow requesting of somebody else. Badge reader shouldn't allow the employee in, was one of the original requests. Need to be able to handle same day versus doing it in advance, and then some notifications, but also updating that capacity as it changes. Knowing we're in phase 1, 25% of the building is allowed. In phase 2, maybe that's 45%, 50%. The system needs to be able to allow for that rapid change. So again, just a sampling, but what is important is the process for what do you do from here. You start the grooming process, and what that means is really, okay, we have all these requirements, so make sure we understand them as the user who needs it, as the persona involved. So one example, be notified when access is approved. We want to be specific with as a requester. And then someone else might need another notification as a fulfiller, as a the security guard. So all those roles that we defined when coming up with the who, we want to make sure there may be duplicate stories, but it's not duplicate in terms of roles. It's maybe duplicate in terms of functionality, but it should be as that individual user. And that really helps in terms of testing and as the requirement is moving forward to make sure it's defined to a specific persona. Now, another critical step in the grooming process is this a good fit for the platform? What's important when you look at requirements is understanding it from a business process level. Really, how should this work as a process in general before you start looking specifically in how does ServiceNow going to handle this? And why that works well is you have the, okay, this is what needs to happen. And then there's certain areas that's a great fit for doing in ServiceNow, or maybe that's something that we can build in ServiceNow. It'll take a little longer, expand the timeline. Really what does that mean? And again, in terms of your timeline and how quickly this needs to be set up. So considering out-of-box configuration, customizations. On the right-hand side, some of you may have seen this before, but this is a great visualization of what we mean in terms of configuration versus customization. So whenever you're building or solutioning an app in ServiceNow, you want to live down here in the green. So this is low complexity, risk, and time. These are things like native configurations, like adding fields to forms, changing labels, changing existing items that are meant to be changed. And as you get up the pyramid, your risk is becoming more high from a complexity perspective, time perspective, and you want to make sure you have justification for what's happening in the yellow, but you really want to make sure you're staying out of the red. So when you're looking at requirements, you also want to consider where does that fit in if we're looking to do this in ServiceNow, and does that make sense? 80-20 rule. A lot of times we see a tool can get very overcomplicated if we're trying to fit a process into ServiceNow that might make sense to handle outside of ServiceNow. But then again, there's the certain pieces that fit in where they make sense. So if you haven't heard of the 80-20 rule before, if you've worked with me in the past, you hear it a lot. It's really talking about you're designing for what happens 80% of the time and not the 20% of the time. Making sure that the standardization is based on what happens the most. And then if there's something that happens as a one-off, what's that process look like? But a lot of times it's better to handle it outside of the tool or with a certain mechanism inside of the tool to say, okay, this needs to happen, but it may not be fully built out. It's really along the start with the majority. As I'm switching to the next aspect of grooming, I'll pause, Dave, if you saw any questions come into the Q&A.
Yeah, so the one question, and this is actually one that comes up all the time when we're talking through this. What are some of the typical challenges you see when you're getting those requirements started? So it's like there's an objective in place from the business, but there isn't really a clear set of requirements. What are some of the challenges you see with getting those into something that's more actionable?
Yeah, that's a great question, and then definitely one we hear a lot. I think for me, that turns back into are we looking at it from the true business process at that point, or were we asked for very technical, the system needs to do X, Y, Z? Because a lot of times when you start to look at it from taking 2, maybe 3 steps back of what does that process look like, that's when you can start getting to more of the questions for the who, the what, the why, the where, and the when. It's hard to get some of the goals or understand why is this requirement being asked without fully understanding that business process. And sometimes it's difficult. That business process may not be defined yet. So that's something that you're sort of flying the plane as you're building it, or when you're doing rapid solutioning. But it's always easier to add in new features, new functionality later on, as opposed to taking perhaps a complex requirement and spending all this time trying to build that one thing in. So really it's the understanding, where does this fit in terms of the 80-20 rule? Do we have a clear understanding of the why it's being asked and trying to dig into that, and being able to make a decision based on that? Because again, knowing potentially something that can go into the backlog if you're doing a true requirements gathering process, you're hearing everything. You want to make sure you document it, but there are some things that are just no-brainers, we need to do, and a lot of times it's aligned to 80-20. And then you have the perhaps more complex items, or maybe it's a one-off, or what's involved with this piece, that because we don't really understand the true value. So something like a backlog can also help with that, making sure you're not stopping the solutioning process for perhaps 1 or 2 items that don't quite make sense or don't fit into the full bigger picture.
Yeah, that's it for now. But if anyone has any questions, feel free to throw them into the chat. It's in the Q&A in the lower right-hand corner. I'm not sure if we called that out at the beginning.
Thanks, Dave. And as far as content, so really a few more slides, just because the requirements gathering portion, this is the most important part of the process when we're talking about solutioning. But then we will go into what the solution actually looks like and jump into a demo for today. And also looking at the clock, I'm not going to demo the actual solution. It is up on YouTube if you want to see the full demo, but I do want to highlight is some of that configurability that we added in. One of the important aspects of solutioning is making sure you can grow into it and that it can be expanded. And really, can a system admin just make some changes to it, or do we have to go in and rebuild the workflow and the code, the business rule behind the scenes, because that's what we want to avoid. So in your requirements grooming process, so back that we were talking about this a little bit, if the tool or the automation in the platform is actually needed. So I have some real examples here for what came up and how we approached that requirement. One requirement was we need to allow users to self-service cancel reservations. Requirement makes sense, but what we actually considered or thought about was it goes back to, if you remember the original where that we talked about, it was mobile, and the reason for mobile was we should do it from email because nobody logs into the system. Nobody being a generic statement, but maybe 80-20 rule, if most of your users aren't in ServiceNow today, why spend time adding a self-service feature that isn't going to be used? And honestly, it's nice to think that users will go in and cancel their reservation if they're not going to be in, but most of the time, we find they don't. It's if you can add the feature in, but will it get used? That falls into that 20% of the time, whereas your process will catch this user did not come in because they weren't screened initially, or the facility or security guard did not say, yes, they entered the building. So you can still make sure that you're approaching that from a, did they actually enter the building or not perspective, versus the providing that capability, is that actually needed? Because here we allowed the fulfiller to do so. So we still had functionality, but it was for the back-end user to cancel a reservation. And that actually also ties into the approval process as well. So automated approval. One of those requirements was if the building's at capacity, we need to get an approval for this user to come into the building. The initial idea was this should be automated, which I think everyone agrees with, but when you start asking them, okay, automated how, there was a lot of scratching of heads. So we're not sure how this should be automated. So from day one, that's something you should not be focusing on. It's a manual decision. If you also think about 80-20, it's more in the 20% for these, the times that it's full and somebody needs to come in. What does that process look like and why do they need to come in versus maybe we need to tell somebody else now you can't come in. It might be criticality of the meeting. I'm coming in to meet some customers and someone was just coming in for an internal thing. Maybe I get precedence over that. But don't spend too much time trying to automate that. That's not, in the grand scheme, that usually doesn't happen that often. And you don't want to spend too much time, again, on that 20% requirement. So I think you're starting to see a theme here. Another requirement we had and that we also hear a lot is, okay, if somebody's not healthy, they can't come into the building and they've been denied access, we need to make the systems stop them. So something like a badge reader should not let the user scan in. Back to also sort of the 80-20 concept, but this is where your security guard or your facility staff would not be allowing them into the building. Through whatever that check-in process is, that's defined, because especially with ServiceNow's safe return apps, there's the QR code that you can scan, or there's the health check-in. But whatever that process is for how users get into the building, you still have your security guard, you still have your facility staff. If they should be blocked, that is going to catch them. For most of our customers, again, this might not be the case everywhere, but don't spend precious time in your development process trying to come up with an integration that we're adding in for making it real time with the badge system if part of your process outside of the tool is going to catch that. And then one more example, needing to allow same-day requests. So this was a good concept because originally you want to make it, if it's a reservation-based system, you should only be able to request for tomorrow as the earliest. You don't want same-day requests in the system. And the reason for this is the way this was solutioned is scheduled outreach, AKA in the morning of the day I'm coming to visit, the user gets a health check questionnaire and says whether I'm healthy or not. So if I'm doing same-day systems, that tie-in to that solution is not going to work here. So here, the concept was day one, same-day requests are just handled by the security guard. Yes, we want to ensure we're not getting a queue or a line of people who didn't go through this process. But again, if you sort of think back to 80% of the time, folks will be using the reservation system and you get a couple of people who are coming in on the same day, the security guard can use a form. And in this case, we built a separate catalog item that doesn't use the workflow for everything else because we didn't want to affect the standardized process in the workflow for a one-off request like same day, because then it doesn't go through the scheduling an email with the health check. It doesn't have to check the health check. It's a manual process of, okay, you're coming into the office. Can you confirm for me that you're healthy and you do not have a temperature? Or you're actually scanning that. Yes, I'm healthy. Okay, that's notated in the ticket you have from an audit perspective. That was confirmed. Okay, so in terms of just more of a technical perspective, so some other questions that come into solutioning, where should this sit on the platform? Is this a custom app? Should this be a standard service catalog item? Should this be scoped? Should this be non-scoped? For this solution, we chose to have this be a part of the standard service catalog. And it was more from an ease of initial use perspective and also knowing some customers' licensing setup. So these are your existing ITIL users. Further security can be added to restrict who can see what as part of the process, but it was built as a scoped application because something that not everyone might know is you don't need a custom table in order to have a scoped application. So this system or this solution was no custom tables were added, but it's still a scope solution so we can move it through the typical development lifecycle of ServiceNow. We can also add a custom table if that was ever needed in the future. So it's a little bit of both, but there was a reason we chose the standard service catalog from an ease of use, getting it out there. Standard security can be leveraged, but it really fell into the service catalog process of this is a request to get access to the building. Am I allowed or not? Then considering something like handling reservation requests and the spaces available. Do we build a custom table to track all of this? Nope, let's keep it simple. And for this concept, it's based on the requested items. This is our living and breathing check of who's allowed. So all the checks of the spaces that are available for that day based on the tentative approvals versus the spaces that were actually full and who came in for that day. It's all just based on requested items. Keep the solution simple. We can do real-time counts of everything. We don't need to have another table tracking all of this data. The platform just provides that functionality. And when you're thinking technical, allow maximum configurations, think system properties. And we'll actually look at how our solution was built with system properties. And I'm taking a look at the clock here. So from a solution perspective, we were definitely configuration focused, system properties. The actual solution itself, again, was really just the service catalog and then asking the questions. And from a flow perspective, you can see this in more detail on the share website or the YouTube video for the actual flow. But this is what we came up with, really just is the building at capacity. If yes, we need that approval. If not, we're tentatively approved. And then on the date of visit, sending out that questionnaire, getting the user's responses, and knowing if we're cleared for visit or not. So just to quickly look at the actual tool in terms of some of the configurations. So just in case you haven't seen this, again, the full demo's on YouTube, but if I'm going into a certain office, I can choose on that day how many spots are remaining. So this is calculated just based on requested items, no custom table needed there. And then once I submit this on the back end, my security staff, my facility staff has full access to who's coming in, who's cleared, who still needs to approve, who's not cleared, and if they come into the office should be sent home. So it's really that central hub to work out of. But I keep going back to system properties and configuration. So in my EchoStor Return to Work application, I would like to talk through some of these. So this is the difference of, do we need a developer in ServiceNow to edit a workflow, edit business rules, script includes, all these technical items behind the scenes, or can we have an admin make changes to the application? So when in doubt, always make as many properties as you can for controlling certain things to not need to edit scripts. So meaning this, every time the building access request is leveraged in this process, there are business rules and scripting that call to that catalog item. Best practice in ServiceNow, you don't want to put an actual sysid or a unique identifier for that request, that catalog item. So instead you want a property to grab that. So now you can make your own building access catalog item and then just change this, and you don't have to, again, edit all those scripts that might be referenced. Then items like a default approval group. So each location, if we were to take a look at our locations, we have the Seattle office for return to work. 100 people are allowed in there normally, and right now we're allowing 25% based on the phase. So again, this is data driven. So now when phase 3 happens and 50% can be in, 75% can be in, I can just update this without updating a script. Same with, is there an approval group? We have a default approval group, or this location might be another approval group. So back to a few more examples of properties just to get you thinking of what's possible in terms of the system properties and the configuration that's available. So if there's a default location, we can set that. This one is critical. What locations are allowed to be requested right now? So not only are we changing the percentage of how many people can be in a building, we're also changing what buildings are actually open. So as these locations get updated, you just make a standard ServiceNow query for the locations that should be involved. So right now it's these 2, and if at next 3 or 4 get added, I just right-click as an admin and say copy query, and that's what I post into the property. So then this will continually edit, again, not needing to edit code. There's a few more different items like the actual catalog item itself, being able to show the remaining capacity like you saw. There's only one spot left for that day. Let's let the admin turn that off if you'd like. Rapid solutioning as well as rapid deployment. So you don't have to spend a lot of time on some of these, well, we don't want this, we don't want that. It's easy enough to say, okay, let's switch that up or change that via property as opposed to having to go into code and commenting items out. So I know we are at time. I know we started a little late as well, but I did want to just ask a few questions before you wrap, if you're able to hang on for a few more minutes, as well as open it up to any additional questions if there are. So if you still have your Kahoot open, or if not, you can go back to Kahoot.it at the bottom here, and the pin is 983619. And we'll move on to the next question. Just if you don't mind, I'd like to collect a little feedback about today, what you thought. So let's get into it. So what did you think of today's webinar? Something that needs improvement, should be more technical focused, more process focused? Any details or feedback you could provide would be great. Wow, okay. I think some of you are lying, but that's great. Good to hear. Thank you. As we do more and more of these, we want to try to make them not too technical, not too process. Hopefully it's kind of a little bit of both here. But what word or phrase today would you say is your key takeaway? What did you get out of today? You could type in any word you want, and it'll populate a word cloud as the answers start coming in. About 8 seconds left. Starting to get a few answers, great. Awesome. So be safe, rapid, configure, processing, properties, and solutioning. Okay, so definitely solutioning is key to this. Properties are key to making the configurations work. So thank you. And really the last question today, this is the first time we're using Kahoot. So did you like using Kahoot? Is it all right? Do you want to keep using it? Should we keep using it, or are you not going to show up to the next webinar if we're using Kahoot? Any feedback you could provide would be great. Awesome. Okay. So keep using it, and yep, it's all right, but no big red flags for perhaps it's not a good tool. It's always good to get some interactive feedback. So before we just check on last questions, thank you for staying a few minutes over. Really key takeaways from today. Consider business requirements and process first when solutioning. Always something good to practice. Always allow for easy configuration and growth, specifically via properties. So as things change, as phases change in the reopening process, we can update via the properties instead of actually changing code. And always consider 80-20 rules in general, but also for initial rollouts. Always easier to add in the future as opposed to go back and try to undo or rethink a process that was custom built considering the tool. So with that, Dave, do we have any questions in the queue before we wrap up?
No, I think that's it. I think a lot of people had to drop a few minutes ago, so we're good on questions, but we'll be following up with everybody after. Thank you very much for joining. And like Paul said, this was our first one, so we're going to be looking to expand on and improve these moving forward. So I'll pass it back to Paul, and we'll wrap up here.
Excellent. I will echo the same. Thank you, everyone, for joining, and we'll see you at the next one.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. This was recorded, so we'll be sending a copy of the recording, and you can pass that along to members of your team if needed. And if you weren't able to catch the beginning or what have you, you'll have that recording. So we'll be sending that out in the next day or so. So yeah, again, thanks everyone for joining, and thanks Paul and Dave for doing this for us.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.